Welcome back to another episode of The Shack Show, and in this episode of The Shack Show, I'm going to be talking about how to catch big bass using live eels.
Just have it really tight. Oh, you just woke up. This is a monster. Holy crap. This is a big fish. You want to see a big fish? Oh my god. That is a big, big fish. Oh. That's a big fish. That's a big fish. That's what we wanted. Oh, that's a big fish. Loosen up just a little bit. Loosen up a little bit. Just a little bit here. Get him in close. Soon we can tire him out. Holy crap, this is a big bass. Holy crap, this is a big bass. Okay, so this is my first real big fish of the season. I'm super stoked with that. I forgot how big and just how big these bass are and they can get. Man, that was a crazy fight.
When it comes to catching really big bass off of estuaries, it's a very small window, and I've talked about this in other videos, but what I really try to look for is choke. It's very simple. I like to look for choke points in estuaries where there's some sort of change in structure, in bottom structure. I like to find deeper water and slower moving water. So if you have an estuary which is pretty shallow with fast current, during full and new moons where you would imagine there to be a lot of bass, they're just gonna get blown out of the estuary, and it's not even worth it to them to go in there, because in reality, these bass don't want to expend a ridiculous amount of energy in the estuaries in very shallow current. Now, that being said, there will be bass in those estuaries during the full and new moons, but they're probably going to be moving pretty quickly and kind of trying to stage up in areas, and it's going to be harder to find more than one bass at a time, and you'll be a little bit lucky to get a really big bass. So I almost do the contrary of that. I try to find the slowest tides of the moon phase, and I try to find these estuaries that have deeper water. I stage up on rips in those choke points in the estuary where there's a change in bottom structure, and I try to fish them in the time period that we have the first few big bass showing up on Cape Ann. You know, maybe there's a sand eel run happening at the same time, maybe there's a herring run happening, and I'll be able to position myself in a spot where there will be a lot of bigger bass. And that's kind of my favorite thing to do when it comes to fishing in these estuaries specifically. A great thing that I always remember, one of my first bigger bass out of the estuary, which was a 38-inch bass. I staged up in this estuary. I heard all of a sudden, the tide was slack and then it started to move again. And I heard all of a sudden these bass sucking bait off the surface of the water from a far way away. And they were just getting closer and closer and closer and closer. And then they were right in front of me. And as soon as they showed up right in front of me, boom, I hooked into a 38-inch bass. And I was super stoked on that. That school of fish was obviously feeding on some sort of bait. I believe it was probably sand eels, could have been herring, but they didn't sound that big of fish, but they were moving in closer and closer. Obviously, there's a few nice bass that I heard flush the toilet on some bait. I mean, it's unmistakable when you just hear that just sucking noise of a big bass just sucking in bait off the surface of the water. It's something, especially at night where everything's so still in those estuaries, and then that happens, your heart just goes into your mouth. It's insane. So that was one main thing that always stuck into my mind of fishing these estuaries, and really trying to find these slower current, slower times. And that will kind of go out to the sand beaches as well. Depending on what you're fishing on a sand beach, there's a few different types of sand beaches. If they're very flat and there's not a lot of structure, so something like that's very notable is like the Brewster Flats, for example, in Cape Cod, are very flat, sandy beach area. And I know like we're talking Cape Ann specifically, but for an example, that's a very flat, sandy, flat area. So what happens is those bass will stage up in little rips and they'll be feeding on bait in those rips. The same thing happens for us on Cape Ann. We have a few beaches where it's very flat and you can fish it very similarly. You know, you're looking for a little deeper rips, even if it's like a foot or two deep, that might hold a really big bass. And you don't want to fish it with really strong tides. Trying to find those slower tides definitely will help to your advantage. The other thing that I look for is on steep drop, like beaches that have these steep troughs and drop-offs, finding places that have a good sandbar and the currents ripping through that is great. It's very similar to fishing like off the rocks. The bass will stage up the same way in those rips and in those areas, and you can swing big plugs through there like darters and stuff like that, where you know you can really swing these big deeper diving plugs through the middle of this. You can even swing big metal lips. Anything like that will work great off of sand beaches. And then when we get into like boulder fields, and boulder fields specifically, what I like to find is where you have a boulder reef that will kind of come up closer to the surface. Even if it's sticking out of the water, that's still great. When it comes up closer to the surface like that, you have these bigger waves that will crash on one side of the rocks. And generally, the way that the rocks are shaped, and if you can find it in the perfect world, it will all sweep around one side of the rock and out the other side. And that's creating this big rip scenario. And you'll have bass either right in where the waves are crashing, or they'll be further out to where the more of the current is sweeping out and like dumping back out into the ocean. So that's where like they'll crash and sweep along, and you'll be able to find those little areas where it's a little hole, there's a lot of current moving along, and you'll be able to swing things like your live eel through there. So I love ealing estuaries like that. I love ealing sand beaches, and I love to eel these areas in these boulder fields. So that's like the structure I'm looking for. Now for the actual way that you fish each one of those with an eel, when I'm talking about fishing a place like an estuary, what I like to do is I like to cast it out as far to my right as I can, and I basically am just maintaining tension to that eel, and I'm letting it swing and do its thing in the current. The eel will swim down right along the bottom, and those bass will see the thing swimming along there, and they'll crush it. Now, covering that much water is really awesome because it's hard to do that in any other scenario. So you're really able to cover a ton of water doing it like that. For the sand beach, it's very similar. If you have that swing of current, there's nothing for those eels to really get themselves stuck in. So you cast it out and you really reel just enough to maintain tension to that eel and let it swing through the current. And it's the same thing when it comes to like those deeper like drop off beaches. Cast it out, let that eel swing through the rip. And that's what I do no matter if it's a steep trough area, flat sand beach. It's very similar, just maintaining tension. Let the eel pretty much do all the work. Then for the boulder fields, you got to switch it up a little bit. You're reeling a little bit faster, kind of like a bucktail through the water. And yeah, you still want to let that eel swim down and be around those rocks and maybe bump off a rock here and there. But that's where those bass are. So you want that eel to swim right down into where those bass are going to be, and the bass will crush it because it's going to go right in front of their nose, and they'll just have no choice but to hit it. And in this day and age, in the way that the fishery is, it's kind of one of the most successful and best ways to fish, because eels, I know a lot of people are against it and want to use plugs and whatever, but eels just catch fish. When it comes to taking out, I mean, you're offering that fish a live bait, and you can fish it kind of like a plug, and it does really well. And so the circle hooks have thrown a little bit of a different, spin to things in there, and I still don't give them a lot of time because you'll still gut hook a big bass even with the circle hook. So what I like to do is I have my rod at a high angle. Once I feel that tap, I'll give it a foot of line and I'll just reel straight into that fish, and then it goes. And after it gets hooked a little bit, I'll still give it a few like stronger pumps to really lock that hook into its mouth. And big bass have very tough mouths. Once that hook gets in there and around the lip, it's not coming out undone. So that's why like eeling with single hooks like that tends to, like, once you really get a good hook set on them, unless like something happens like terminal tackle breaks, you get cut off or whatever, that hook generally won't come out of the fish, which is really awesome. So that's kind of my very like my basics and but specific basics for fishing those different areas when it comes to, you know, spring, summer, fall fishing. So in the spring, I like to fish in the estuaries. Spring, summer, I'll be fishing off the sand beaches, and summer, mostly I'm fishing off the boulder fields with eels. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you like this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.